Hello, hearing this second half of this really, really wonderful podcast. I was just re-listening to the second half there, and there's so many great moments. One of them I was kind of laughing at the end was talking about how there is a lack of representation, especially in research and the therapy space as a whole, the theories, the founding fathers of the psychological theories. And we were mentioning that often people are drawn towards talking about themes because they're processing something themselves. And we often use we, us, humans experience this or could experience this. And although that is offering us an opportunity to relate to what they're sharing, sometimes it's a block. It's maybe not acknowledging that I'm working through this, that sense of vulnerability of, I'm actually processing this myself. It might resonate with you, but this is what's going on for me. And it's just a funny kind of thing to acknowledge, especially when we reflect back on some of the building blocks of counseling theory and what might have been going on for that person as they were processing their own life and exploring different things about the human condition. Um, Lots of cool things is around connecting with your body. And Francesca, just to end this wee introduction, Francesca ends the podcast by describing and reminding us that our bodies are capable of not only storing pain and trauma and the history of that, but we're also able to hold joy and good and connecting with those anchors in our body and giving ourselves space to reflect on the joy that is in there is a really important thing to tune into too. Sometimes we think going inwards and going to therapy is unpacking the pain. And sometimes it is, but sometimes it's connecting and reminding ourselves of the good too. Um, Thank you for listening and hope you're doing good wherever you are.
So you're finding it difficult to find time for yourself. And then I was like, oh, but that's what it is. And I didn't even notice at the time, like it was such a new concept. I was like, oh, what do you mean time for myself? And I'm thinking that, like having like even the head space to go there and to feel like that's what I can start doing. It's not what we, I don't think that as an industry, because mental health is part of the wellness industry, broadly, but we're all part of the same category. We cannot just ask people to necessarily go there, just create space. Or like sometimes I hear this, especially with meditation, like that once you meditate, you will have more space in your life and more time, which I totally understand, like as well with the body. Once I get that into my practice, then time bends and expands. And it's so true, right? If I want to gain extra time, I just stay with my body, but that's such like a shift that we cannot pretend people get into simply because we've been there, and expecting that everyone has the same, has the same starting point than us to get there, and I'm thinking about, I don't know, people who have kids, you know, finding the time for it, or, people who are, in marginalized body, if they're going through so many, intersectional forms of oppression, where is the space to actually think about, yeah, my body has meaning and I want to nurture that when there are so many fights that they need to fight to get to that point, so, I'm very hopeful we can all get there, but it's about like, how can we as an industry like have a different, language and communicate that things are possible, and at the same time being aware that, the starting point is different for different people.
Absolutely. And I've been really thinking about how to incorporate that into my practice because my early beginnings are mixed with challenge. And the reason I wanted to become a counselor was because of my lived experience, both growing up in adversity and all that kind of stuff, and how I incorporate that into my practice as a therapist, knowing that the people I want to work with, I'm working with. alongside there's certain people I'm not meeting. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it comes to that place you were talking about earlier around 6 months ago, maybe some of this stuff wouldn't land in the same way as it lands to you now. I think 10 years ago, some of the stuff I'm saying to myself and the people I'm working with would never have landed to me because
Mm-hmm.
I had different context. I had therapy growing up in the culture I grew up in, it just wasn't, it was still basic needs were being met, and the fog of not having certain basic needs or the stress that comes from just living day by day meant that the thought of connecting with my body or connecting with therapy just felt so far out of reach, like a different language. Felt like a completely different language that it couldn't relate to. And finding, I guess it is connected in some ways because it's like finding the middle way where I still connect with those roots and be able to still be me, and finding those kind of, it's a bit of an identity shift. It comes for me, it comes to class and culture and inequality and all the things that you described, and how I understand that in my life now and how I remember it when I was younger, and finding a middle way within that, and how I find a different language, because I noticed that certain language that you get used to using, you don't realize how exclusive it is. Your meaning of a word might land completely different. Even the word therapy, even the word counseling. Is that reachable? Is that relatable? If you maybe have heard it now, but say 5 years ago, it was kind of like, that's not for me. That's not for people like me, because I'm so busy doing just getting by. So it's a bit of a tangent, but it's something that's on my mind recently that's came about in a roundabout way because I'm just thinking about why I began this process, and yeah, why was it important to me and what's shifted and changed since then. And it definitely feels like recognizing that words mean different things to different people at different times in their life, and just working that process out. And I'm mindful that that does connect with social media and how we share about our work and how we communicate, how we practice, and yeah, who are we connecting with in that, and that's deeply important. But at the same time, unconsciously, we're disconnecting with some, you know. And I know it's quite slightly connected to what we were talking about, but in some ways, it is just the whole encouraging us to recognize the barriers and the inequality that exist, and recognize that we could be eliminating or alleviating, not eliminating, alleviating some of those barriers just by checking in with the language that we're using and how we're speaking about these topics. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely, Jen. That's exactly the thing, and I'm thinking a lot about that the jargon that is doing the rounds as well around like bodies, right? Like about like, somatic therapy, that there is a lot of like, oh, that's a bit of titration and pendulation, which I think I mentioned before, or, like the nervous system and, your parasympathetic and sympathetic and versal, whatever it is, right? And I'm thinking about like, there is a lot of like talks around, and I'm noticing that in therapy, that when I, get contacted, a bit less now, but it was more in the past, simply because I think I'm wording things differently. And so I'm getting a different type of people approach me. But in the past, it was mainly about like, this is how I present, and they would just name attachment styles, they would name diagnoses, they would name, I don't know, like specific words to explain some of their experiences. And, fair enough, I understand the importance of these things, for some people are very grounded and very defining, and they create a sense of communities. And for sure, most of these things that give people access to services and support. As a therapist, sometimes, I then struggle to connect because I'm like, words can be very, very distancing, and they don't allow for connection. And so like sometimes I'm like, okay, just I hear you, but I want to know what's your experience of it. So then, again, let's not have molds where you feel like you need to fit in, so then you're heard and seen, and acknowledged by, you know, just share with me, that's the mold, what goes in, what goes out. So then I know what we can work with. Otherwise, it's just an exercise where, for me, where I have to learn so much about everything, and it means that I retain very little of everything, you know, and then I, you know, bring in a lot of assumptions because I'm coming in with so many like personal theories about life, right? And on the other side is also for the client, you know, like how much do they lose autonomy and power by fitting in molds that are creating so far still mainly by men, you know, who are most likely in their like, well, 40s, 50s, 60s, you know, white, you know, majority of them from the US,
Yeah.
you know, like, or for Central Europe, you know what I mean? It's just like, oh, who created those molds and why? You know, why do we need more molds? Like, you know, like why? You know what I mean? Like,
You know, I heard something recently on that, that those molds were created for them.
sure,
They're actually just projecting their experience and saying we and us. That's all they're doing. And with maybe not
absolutely,
wanting to be vulnerable and say, by the way, this is my experience. They're actually saying, this is the world's experience.
absolutely.
Okay. But it's really funny just to say that, like, okay, that theory is created. Where does it come from in them? You know? And also recognizing that they're multifaceted humans that had a life after they created the theory too. I've heard a lot of stories about people who create theories and concepts, and that whole rise of adoration shifts and changes who they are. But then when we only hear about the theory, we hear about the starting point. But actually, they've been a human that's went through a journey with being admired, and it shifted and changed with them. And I think it's really nice just to think, okay, maybe some of it's true and it can be extrapolated and generalized. But like you said, it is disempowering, because then you think that the information is outside of you. And
Mm-hmm.
and it can be, like you said as well, grounding, give us definition, give us a grounded kind of, okay, that's me, an identity, a sense of belonging, all the things that come with that when we're seeking that existentially, wanting to draw things in. But at the same time, it kind of disconnects us from our congruent, authentic self, or prevents us spending a lot of time working out what our own theories about ourselves are. And it's finding the balance between allowing information in and insight in, and then working out our internal world for ourselves, by ourselves. And I really just think that's so funny, of especially in the kind of psychological theory realm, that it's like
Mm-hmm.
how many people were actually talking about themselves. Because that's what most of us are doing when we're talking about something a lot. When someone writes a book or shares a podcast, they're offering insight for others, but they're working through. I think if I'm really true to myself, I'm working through things myself too. If I'm tuned into something, if I'm drawn towards something, it's because it's bringing up stuff for me, as well as maybe it'll resonate with others if I share it. And I think that is a beautiful acknowledgement, but it's a vulnerable acknowledgement. So if someone is talking about something that is hard to talk about, it's easy to say humans, we, us. It keeps it outside of us, right? Instead of saying, I've experienced this, does this resonate? And giving someone else the opportunity to say if it does or not. And I think that that's a lovely way to kind of tune into how theories can kind of, like you said, mold. Yeah.
Absolutely. You know, when I started the podcast, which, by the way, I'm going to just share the name, which is We Are Here Too on Mental Health Abroad. So clearly, you know, like it's a podcast about, you know, it started like with my experience of life abroad and going through, you know, understanding my mental health and, you know, and working through my own struggles. But it was so interesting because the time that I started it, it was just, was it last year? So it was 2023. But it was like in the making. I started it during the pandemic, you know, the thought about it all and what I wanted to talk about. And for sure, it was coming at the time where I was really struggling with like my sense of belonging, like who I am, why am I here, you know, why I don't feel connected, you know, what else is there for me, you know, like, you know, so many questions about like, especially because my family was far, I couldn't reach them. at the time, like I had like my tickets to go home for Christmas and they closed the border. And that was going to be my first Christmas at home after like 10 years at the point, no, well, less, 9 years at that time, because I was always working on Christmas Day. So it's just like, no. And I started to feel like maybe I should be home with my family, in Italy. And I really needed like to have like an outlet to share some of the struggle that I was going through as a foreigner in the UK, when they were trying to implement also Brexit, so and I really needed like a community, because up to that point I had no community around me of people who were like foreigners. I only had people from like the west of Scotland, mainly from Glasgow. And so, and then for sure, like that was part of my journey. And I found it so useful, because then like through the podcast, I started reading stuff and I was like, okay, that's what's happening to me. Okay, I'm angry now because that's the phase where I should be angry, and then I started thinking about what can I do to actually, like understand, what meaning I'm giving to my life, and I suppose maybe the episode about meaning making, but also I think I did one about like know your whys, or remember your whys. And I completely forgot about mine. So I was like, why am I abroad? Why am I away from my family? It made no sense to me in that moment. And I just needed the space to explore that for myself, which now, if you add, fast forward a few years, like the connection that I have with my body and with nature, now I have other answers,
Yeah.
but the podcast for sure, like, led me there. But as you said, like, we theorize things based on our own experiences.
Mm.
Yeah, it's a shame that nowadays what we have available in terms of like scientific literature, there is still a prevalence of men who communicate that, and we have less like, marginalized people in marginalized bodies who are coming forward,
Yeah.
with manuals, even like somatic experiencing, it's like a man. And the book,
The book, yes.
we have like, I don't know if you're aware at these moments, maybe you are like, there is like a summit on trauma. And I was checking the panel, and I think like the panelists are mainly men.
Oh,
And then I was like, where? And I'm saying this because it's not that I don't want to hear men talking about their experiences. I just want to be of like
yeah.
diversity,
Yeah.
so that I feel also represented.
Right.
You know.
And you can begin to tune into these huge subjects that impact our life in a way that connects with you. Couple of things to share before you
Mhm.
talked about the lack of representation that I could talk about a lot. And maybe we can end on there and we could always do
Mhm.
this again because it's so lovely to connect with you in this way. Um,
Likewise. Mhm.
one thing that you said in the podcast that I listened to, I think this was before, or maybe it was, yeah, you mentioned, and I love this idea, and it's tough going when it's happening, but that we take everything in a wee bag with us wherever we go. Whether that's the pain that we and distress that we have, that
Mhm.
maybe the volume turns down for a wee bit wherever we go for a wee second, we get temporary relief. But it comes with us and it moves with us. And same goes when we feel okay, we feel grounded and centered. And I think that that's kind of that discussion around anchors, whether that's anchors within our body or anchors within nature, the wind, like you said, of seeing the leaves, seeing the wind, like that's things that are everywhere that we can connect with. But we do take stuff with us. And I used to think, and I've had times in my life where I physically ran away from stuff to not sit with it. I've moved to see if that'll shift things in myself. But here we are again with the same thing in a different setting. And I'm forced to face it, and I think that connects with at the time in my life where I really was forced to face it. I didn't have a lot of voices that I felt connected and represented my experience. So to end, I guess, on that theme, I went through an injury, and I was forced to stop running away from all the stuff. And I was forced to kind of explore external ways to soothe and internal ways that were different to just running away. So it was like turning the volume up on all the things I was running away from. And as a way of processing that, I had a lot of pain and some kind of heavy months. And then I went into this mode that I often do, even out with hard times, where I seek information. It's like, it's definitely within me to be like, who else has experienced this? Is there writing? Is there podcast? Is that theme mirrored somewhere else? So I did do that, and I listened to lots of different podcasts, and I was drawn towards different books, and I moved to Orkney and lived in Orkney for a couple of summers, came home and then went back and listened to podcasts the whole time I was there. I had breaks where I was meeting people and connecting with people. I worked in a youth hostel and I met people from all over the world, and I got to show up in a different way. You know, I left my identity of who I was in Scotland, as a runner, all the stuff that I labeled with me, and I could kind of be whoever I needed to be in the moment, just show up as myself. And I really learned to have more fluidity with that. But at the same time, in retrospect, I was listening to a lot of male voices and I was reading a lot of male books. Naturally, unconsciously, there was popular, even like fiction books. And I loved some of the books I listened to and read. But at the same time, there was a kind of disconnect ever so slightly from my experience of mental health challenges, of growing up in Scotland, with inequality. And like there were certain people I was really drawn towards that were voicing opinions that I really resonated with, lived experience I really resonated with. But there was a slight shift because there was not a lot of women I could find talking about those experiences or people I could relate to fully in their entirety. And I felt in some ways sad about that. Before I even moved to Orkney, I remember when I was studying physiology, and I've maybe shared about this before with you because we talked about this specific subject of representation of in research specifically. And I remember talking to my teacher and saying, how come all of this research is kind of like guesstimated for women? Like it's like, well, we've done all the research on men, worms, rats, anyone else but women, because women have a menstrual cycle, which means that it's confusing the results, which means it's all confusing because our hormones shift and the hydration shifts. And so the nutrients work in a different way, and all this kind of added complexities, which they already factor in, all the complexities within research that can skew the results. So it's another just factoring in. But I did really notice that when I was studying the body and nutrition and all that kind of stuff, that there was missing gaps in the research and there was a lot of guessing for it. And so I guess I'm saying in a roundabout way that once you become aware of that, there's a huge injustice and anger that comes up. And then for me anyway, and then it settled. And then I thought, okay, I just need to seek out more. And so I've went on a whole journey after having the injustice and the recognition of it. I've went on a journey to seek out people, whoever that may be, that I resonate fully with their experience, and just acknowledging, okay, where are the authors I'm reading from? Or because you can be quite guided in popular books, popular culture, like it can just guide you without you knowing. And podcasts are all the things that you're getting your information from, and just being, yeah, just slightly more aware of that. I'm much more attuned to how I feel when I listen to people, and or after I listen to a podcast, where am I? You know, and just mindful of how things contribute to how you feel, and they can take you down different paths, kind of come in full circle of that sense of molding you. Everything is kind of contributing to how you view yourself, how you view the world. And if the dominant, like you described, is a specific person with specific characteristics and privilege, then you're never going to feel a sense of belonging because the voices you're listening to is always slightly disconnected from you. So that's the gift, I
Absolutely.
guess, in social media and meeting people like you and finding like, there is people that can attune to my experience, and I can attune to theirs, and we can kind of create new meaning for ourselves, even if we still acknowledge globally that there is inequality and privilege that exists. And yeah,
Mm.
I hope
Yeah,
that made sense. Yeah.
it did. Yes, absolutely. You know, and I'm also thinking, like, for example, like on my counseling training, I was the only foreigner. There was one other person who then left within a few months, you know, and then someone who was like most likely second or third generation immigrants, you know, but brought up in Scotland with a clear Scottish accent. So you know, sometimes it was difficult as well for me to make meaning of what was going on because that was not factored into the classes, you know, for no one's fault in a way, because that was not, you know, what they, you know, how I think the course was created. We talked about like diversity and differences as well. You know, but there, I suppose what was missing was a certain type of nuance that at the time I did not know I needed, you know, whilst now I would be much more vocal and I would bring in a lot more, whilst back then I felt like, oh, maybe I like other people and I want to hear other people talking about this. And it was incredibly underwhelming, you know, because it was like, I need me, you know, my first year when I did the counseling skills training, and we were listening to recording, like people were more focused on the way that I was pronouncing words and the words that I was not understanding that the client was saying, you know what I mean? Which is fair enough, right? But rather than focusing, right, what else they got, they just picked on all of these things, you know, that, you know, they stayed with me not long, but long enough to feel like, oh, maybe I shouldn't train as a counselor because my English is not to a level where people understand me, where clients understand me, where I understand clients. And then, you know, again, a few years later, I actually learned, you know, like the most important thing is like communication and how I communicate to others. So whenever a client, I didn't understand the word the client was saying, I would ask them to repeat or to explain it to me. And now I have clients who are like, you know, so lovely, you know, when I don't know a word, they just say, they just ask me, especially if it's slang, if it's like very, you know, colloquial,
Yeah.
broad Scottish or broad Glaswegian. They're just like, do you know this word, Francesca? Sometimes I do,
Yeah.
because I got my fair share of like Glaswegian words that I can understand. But sometimes like I have no idea. And the beauty of, you know, them explaining that to me, it gives me so much more insight of what they meant by it.
Yeah.
You know, and sometimes they bring as well Italian expressions. If I don't have it in any other language, I just say, I'm going to share with you an Italian saying, and I'm going to explain it. And
Lovely.
then I share it in Italian first, and then explain it in English. And then they're just like, oh yeah, that's exactly, you know,
Yeah.
interesting. And then we work, you know, with that as well. That, you know, during the training, I thought it was not possible, you
Yeah.
know, because I was not showed that as a possibility. You know, it
Right.
was not a barrier that they said it's not going to happen. You know, that's not, you know, I was never told that that's not possible. It's not an opportunity, but
Yeah.
I was never showed the other way around.
Yeah.
Right. So what do you do if you don't know?
And to think that that was the focus and that plant seeds, like you said, that sat with you for a wee while after, of a sense of like, is this my place? When
Mhm.
actually now hearing that full circle of actually your sense making with each other, you know, and that's a
Yeah.
beautiful connecting experience. No matter where we're coming from, that's the gift of therapy, that we're actually trying to make sense to with each other. You know, what does that mean? What do you mean by that? Because you might be using that word, I might be using that word, but we might have a different meaning, or we might share the meaning and we can get a sense of that. But that's a whole connecting process that I think it takes, like we were saying earlier, a vulnerability to say, I'm not really sure. And in the
Mhm.
process of saying you're not sure, you're sharing that in a vulnerable way, but you're also offering someone else the opportunity to go, let me tell you about that. And that's a lovely feeling of like, if someone has the resources within them to do that, it's a real gift to then be able to do it and share. And
Yeah.
it creates an equal dynamic in the therapeutic relationship where you're both teaching each other, and it makes where you're from your identity rather than so many other
Yeah.
things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we can open a massive chapter about like, you know, some identities are better received than others. You know,
Yeah.
and I'm saying this as Italian, right? Like, you know, everywhere I went, they were like, oh my God, Italian, you know, and I would just like, I don't know, you know what I mean? Like, and then people from other nationalities that I found so interesting because I've never met maybe someone from that nationality, but because it was so, it was less, I don't know, glamorized,
Yeah.
like the Italian culture. Maybe they were not received as, I don't know, excitingly, like I found it all the time. Oh my God, Italian pasta, pizza, the usual. Like it's always the same things that I hear. And maybe my partner is Czech. And he said, oh, I'm from the Czech Republic. People are like, Yeah. And I was like, oh, Italy, yeah, Bella Italia. I don't like, that
Different
it's
sensation.
it's so incredibly random. And I
Yeah.
appreciate that people try to connect, but then I'm also like, we are connecting on something that, to me, like I don't give weight to that in the slightest, right? Like I
Oh,
don't want to use that as a way of connecting because I know that it's so random. It's just like to me, for the way that I view the world, right? To me, it's just random that I landed in this Italian body, right? With these features, and so like I found it very, very interesting. And but on the other side, though, when I see Italians nowadays, I'm just like, oh, someone who speaks my language, but simply because I'm missing that.
yeah. Oh, that's another whole journey, isn't it, into that?
Absolutely, yeah, yeah.
But I love that. There's so many things that you just say so beautifully. That idea of giving weight to things and acknowledging what we give weight to and what's important to us right now. I feel that's a really lovely place to end. And before we kind of, is there anything that you would like to share to end? How are you feeling just now? How have you felt throughout this process? You feel you've shared everything you wanted to share?
Yeah, there is one thing to end um, that I would like to say, which connects to something that you just mentioned. And it's, going back to the body and taking things slowly and such. Like, I suppose it's the reminder that, our bodies are not just capable of storing trauma, they're also able to store what's good. And if we carry trauma with us, we can also carry what's good. And it's a reminder, and that's about the anchors, right? Like find your anchor in a way or another, connect to what it makes you feel good and just stay with that feeling. That's the best way to go about getting to know our bodies,
Mhm.
because then we can carry that good feeling,
Yeah.
of like goodness. There was a time where going up a hill with my bike would give me, like, I would literally be breathless, no matter how many miles I would cycle a week. And then after I did this exercise on my way up, I was just like, but my body's strong, I feel good with it. And I stopped feeling breathless on that stretch of the road. So there are ways that we can, remember that our bodies can also store all the goodness, and not just, trauma.
That's a lovely reminder.
Uh-huh.
And the focus on joy and storing
Mhm.
the lightness of that. And whether that comes from music or sound or
Mhm.
oh, just, and I promise I'll end here, but the idea of what parts of your body do you like and how can you tune into them? You know,
Mhm.
when someone says go to your body, you can extrapolate that to mean, well, I really like my hands, so I'm going to go there.
Mhm.
Just the kind of places that you feel comfortable with rather than this overwhelming entirety that I might have a lot of conflicting feelings about. So
Absolutely.
yeah,
Mhm.
I would love and anytime we can do this again, whether that's
Sure.
to promote any work that you're doing, whether it's just have a wee chat about